Lawrence was announced as the founder of the Juniper Foundation, but before he did that, he was the CFO of a company you may have heard of called Pixar, which was in fact actually a bit of a mess when you joined. So, and it is related to your journey to Juniper. So I think maybe, Lawrence, could you tell us a little bit about what you did at Pixar and how that led you to what you're doing now?
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard, and hi everyone. Thanks for having me at Concordia. The real reason I'm here is because I heard that one of the Muppets is coming later today, and I have to represent Woody and Buzz and see what they have to say about policy. But my journey at Pixar started with a call from Steve Jobs in 1994, and literally I picked up my phone, and he was on the other end of the line, and he said, I never had spoken to him before. He said, hey, I have this little company I want to tell you about, and I think you could help us run it. And that company was called Pixar. And when I went to Pixar, a lot of people don't know this, but not only was it not an entertainment company, but Steve Jobs and Pixar had basically been written off as has-been companies that were going nowhere. So it took 12 years, but it was a long journey, and eventually Pixar had, sort of became the most successful story in entertainment history, basically, which I wrote a book about called To Pixar and Beyond.
So you've talked a little bit about how some of the issues that you saw at Pixar and how it sort of was not having trouble finding its way led you to found Juniper, which is basically trying to take lessons from, let's say, the wisdom of the East combined with the ingenuity of the West to try to balance them.
That's right. So I went on Silicon Valley. I'm sort of a strategist, really, at heart, an executive and a strategist. And Silicon Valley is about solving problems. And it's very, very hard for Silicon Valley companies to succeed. We see the success stories in Silicon Valley, but the conditions actually for companies or organizations or entities to flourish are really rare. And I began to observe a different problem. And that problem was that people around me were really stressed out. And I asked myself, if I'm sitting basically in the land of prosperity, the land of Silicon Valley that has more prosperity than probably any time in human history, why is everybody so stressed out? Why isn't there so much mental anguish? And so I went off to try to understand what that problem was about, and that took me on this long, now 15-year journey into the world of Eastern philosophy and Tibetan Buddhism, where I actually did find answers to this question.
So, one of the things I found so interesting about your story and in your book, you talk about the middle way, and you have this wonderful analogy about everybody has on their shoulder sort of a free spirit and an artistic spirit, and on the other shoulder there's this sort of bureaucrat keeping the trains running on time, and that in fact the key to happiness is to combine those two, and that if you don't combine those two, you end up either very frustrated or stagnated. So I think it would be helpful maybe you could talk a little bit about the middle way. And is the middle way your view of the answer to why so many people are so upset when objectively the world seems to be doing so well?
It is in a way. So the middle way is a philosophy. It comes out of the East, and it's a 2,000-year-old philosophy. It has a lot of depth to it, but its basic tenet is that we suffer when we are in extremes, and we flourish when we are in harmony. And the key to the middle way is identifying the extremes that we're living. So I often give an example to illustrate it. It's as if we have two people who are living inside of us. One person is a bureaucrat, and the function of the bureaucrat is to get things done. The bureaucrat is a performance junkie. And the bureaucrat worries, will I get up on time? Am I studying hard enough? Will I make it to the airport? And all of these things. And the bureaucrat is extremely good at attainment. And we have another person inside of us that I loosely call like a free spirit or an artist. And the free spirit or the artist inside of us doesn't care anything about getting things done, only cares about living, experiencing joy, experiencing friendship, just experience the kind of radiance of being alive. And what the middle way says is that if we get stuck in either one of these places, we will suffer as a result. So if all of our life is about bureaucracy and performance and all of that, we may accumulate a lot of things, but we'll wonder if we ever truly lived. And if on the other side, we are all about so-called, smelling the roses and having that kind of spirited life, then we will suffer from lack of momentum. Pixar was a case of a company that was stuck on the side of artistry. When I arrived at Pixar in 1994, it had the best technology, creativity, and artistry in the world, but the company was completely frustrated for lack of momentum. And what we essentially did was put enough bureaucracy, administration strategy around it without killing the creative spirit. And what I came to see, though, in life in general, and I now have seen this in so many places, not just in Silicon Valley in terms of stress and burnout and anxiety, but anxiety, depression, loneliness, lack of friendship, lack of meaning, all of these things have increased dramatically in the last 10 or 15 years. There was a study that came out just a couple of weeks ago that said on college campuses, rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation have doubled since 2012. And I asked myself, this is a staggering number. How can this be in a culture that is so prosperous, especially on college campuses? And my answer is that we are stuck in a narrative, a consumption and a performance and a materialist narrative that the middle way would say if we remain stuck in that place, we may have a lot of prosperity, but we won't have the sort of joie de vivre that's possible from that.
So what is your prescription for individuals, and I think in the context of Concordia, maybe it's slightly different, but for organizations to, I think you said to me yesterday that the conditions for flourishing are a very rare thing, but what is it that people can do for themselves and for their organizations to avoid this trap and to achieve the middle way?
Yeah, I have this view that, you're like, if you play a video game of civilization, a civilization video game, and you set up the conditions, and if your civilization flourishes, you win the game, but if your civilization fails, you lose the game. And when you lose the game, it just says, game over, would you like to try again? And you can try, hundreds and hundreds of times. And I asked the question, are the conditions that we have set up now for our culture, for our civilization, the right conditions for us to flourish? And my take is that we haven't quite got it right yet. And the reason is because we live too much in a consumption, performance, materialist paradigm. And what I'm very careful about is not to say that we should throw out that paradigm, because I don't think that's the answer at all, but we have to balance it with another paradigm. And I went off to learn about that. As I said, I spent 15 years studying Buddhist philosophy and meditation and all these things. And what I discovered is that while we over here in modern affluent culture have focused on our ingenuity for the material world, those masters over there spent 2,000 years focusing on their ingenuity for the inner world, the world of the mind. And my take is that a civilization will flourish when it can bring both of those worlds together. It's not about one or the other. We're suffering here. We have a lot of prosperity, but we're suffering from all these mental anguish ailments. Over there, they have no prosperity, but they have tremendous strength of mind. And what I would like to see, and the prescription that I think we need to do, is to bring these two worlds together. That will take a long time. A lot of the problems, this morning hearing about these amazing efforts in women's rights and addressing poverty and these kinds of things, I think a part of the problem is changing our narratives about these things. We're stuck in old narratives. And the function of meditation, the function of the middle way, the function of these things is to get us unstuck from these narratives. I was sitting with a founder of a Silicon Valley company who had just hired a CEO for the company. This was just last week. It's just an anecdote. But he hired a CEO. The CEO was a woman. And he had gone around introducing her to people. And he couldn't believe it, but he said that even in Silicon Valley, she wasn't getting the attention, right, that he would have expected that she would get if she had been a male, if she had been a man. And he and I were lamenting this, and I was saying it's a problem of narrative. We're stuck in a paradigm and a way of thinking, and we have to shift the way of thinking. What those Tibetan masters over there created is a mechanism for us to change our inner paradigms, to change our way of thinking. That, I think, is something we need.
Has anyone ever gotten it right, historically? Any civilization?
Not that I know of, actually, because a lot of civilizations, they come, they rise, and they fall. But my take on this is that our experiments with civilization are very young. As a species, we're only a couple of 100,000 years old. And as a modern species, since the time of agriculture, we're only 10,000 years old. In terms of real modern culture, the capitalist culture and all that, we're only 300 years old. So I think if an advanced civilization landed here, they'd see, we were just getting going. And so I think we have an opportunity to sort of bring these two worlds together and create something really special.
So what does Juniper do? And this seems like a Herculean task. What are you, you started a new organization, which is now not so new, but what are you doing, I guess, to chip away a little bit at this problem?
Yeah, it takes chipping away. I think this is a generational thing. I actually, I'm used to, in startup world, 5 years is a long time. So, but in the world that I'm in now, it goes by like eons. So this is really a 100-year startup. But I co-founded this organization called the Juniper Foundation, and its first task was to capture for use in the West these methods that come from the East. So Juniper Foundation right now is basically a holder of these extraordinary philosophies and practices that we've spent 20 years culling from basically the Tibetan Buddhist canon and other things like that. The next phase of Juniper will be having acquired and attained all of this kind of wisdom and knowledge to figure out the ways to share it, figure out the ways to bring it into modern life in a way that's useful and applicable for us.
What is, for people individually who want to reset and take some of this wisdom, I know you're a big proponent of meditation, what are the things that people can do individually to try to rebalance their lives other than, because it's hard to, I think, just say, well, I'm going to start measuring myself differently. I mean, what is the sort of the gateway to this today as opposed to over the next 500 years?
You're right. It is very hard to say I'm going to start measuring myself differently. But I think we have to start measuring ourselves differently. The reason I think that is because we've become a culture that we measure ourselves by measurable outcomes. We've become very quantitative. So we measure ourselves by grades, by money, by Facebook likes, by LinkedIn friends. We have all these measures that measure how well we're doing. That's like outsourcing our self-esteem to some outer, measuring entity. And what it does is when we value ourselves through sort of quantitative, measurable elements, we devalue the qualitative elements. Like, how do you measure friendship? How do you measure peace of mind? How do you measure joy? So we're not focused on these things. And so I am, of course, all for meditation, but I think more important than meditation, because it's very easy to keep things like meditation and yoga as a sideshow. It's very common now for corporations in Silicon Valley and everywhere else. They have mindfulness classes and meditation classes. I think it's helpful, but I don't think that's the answer, because I think the answer is to elevate the respect for your own inner life to the main stage, to take the attitude that my inner world is as important as my outer world. And when you take that attitude, things will flow from that. Yes, perhaps you'll take up meditation or those kinds of things, but I think it's the priority that we give it that matters more. And when we prioritize that, all of a sudden, doors and insights and wisdom will open up. I'm sure of that.